Hi, my name is Lorraine Watry and welcome to my studio. I am a watercolor artist and I've worked with watercolor for 26 years now, and I thought I would start a new series of videos where I go over different tips, tricks, and techniques for working with watercolor. And hopefully these short videos will help you in your journey, and if you have a question or a technique that you would like to see, please comment below and I will try to accommodate that in a future video. Hi, this is Lorraine Watry, and I am going to go over how to create dark water in a scene. I am using water lilies as my image, and I have painted two of the same demos here where I'm using just basic water lilies, the petals, and then I will paint the darker water around that. To start the video, I will show a couple of my water lily paintings so that you can see if I am doing an actual painting, how I would use the dark water in the scene. And I will speed up this portion of the painting so you can see that right quick, and then I will get started. Okay, so now that I have the water lily pads dry, I will go ahead and start the demo on doing the dark water. And in order to, the reason I'm doing two is that I want to show the difference between painting on some water and leaving it, and then going back into or adding layers to the second one so that you can see as you build it how the contrast in value can really make the lily pads pop and gives more interest into a scene. So one of the quicker ways of putting the paint down is to have your board tipped, because it helps the paint move down the page. And I have it tipped, however I'm going to adjust that a little bit later, so I will explain then. And I used cobalt blue and some aureolin yellow from Holbein for some of the greens, and then also New Gamboge, my warmer yellow, with the cobalt for some of the, I just said that wrong. I used cobalt and aureolin from Holbein for some of the cooler greens, and then New Gamboge mixed with the cobalt for some of the warmer parts of the lily pads. And I am not going to get into painting those, but I wanted just to have that there so you can see the contrast. So in order to try to make the water kind of quickly, I'm going to use indigo and some quin magenta, although I might actually switch that. Let me grab, I'm going to test this right quick. So indigo and quin magenta, there's indigo by itself. However, indigo, I find when I use it, that it dries a lot lighter than what it looks like it will dry, and I could use some other options. This was just one that I wanted to play with, and so to get dark water kind of quickly, I thought I would use this. But like I said, it does dry lighter than what I might want. So I'm actually going to pull out my Quin Burnt Scarlet, which is this color, and indigo is a deep dark navy blue, basically. And because this is sort of its opposite, is a rusty orange brown, it might work well, it might work better than the Quin Magenta, which I had out on my palette, that is a cooler and makes more of a purple, where if I'm trying to go more toward black, this mixed with my indigo might be the ticket to give me what I want, rather than going with the Quin Magenta. Yeah, see how much that goes black really fast, whereas over here this was more purple. This is the indigo mixed with the Quin Magenta. So I think I will use those, just something new for me to play with. It's always good to try different color mixes. And I am going to start by wetting the area. Now, it depends on if you're doing a large area or a smaller area, if you want to wet the paper or not. Sometimes I use water in order to create kind of blurry, soft-edged shapes, and then other times I use it to help me get around an area. And because I'm trying to do this video with a little bit of speed, I am going to try to wet most of the paper with clear water and just kind of quickly, so if I go over an edge here or there, I'm not too worried about it. And the idea for this first one will be to put a layer of color down and then just leave it. And if I am actually doing water, as you saw in some of my paintings, they get very detailed and have lots of layers and reflections and little bubbles and things going on in them. So this is not typical for what I do, but it's just a way to show you that if you stop with that first layer, it's usually not enough. It depends on how you mix your colors. Sometimes you can get it exactly right. Okay. Now, when you put water on the paper and then add color to it, you are actually lightening the color you are adding because you have placed water on the paper. So basically you're adding some water to your mix. So just so that you know that. Okay, coming around. And depending on how detailed your shape is or how big it is, a lot of the time I will actually mask my main objects. So I might have, if this were my actual painting, I might have masked these lily pads and not painted them in already. They would be protected with either masking fluid or masking tape, and I would paint the darker, bigger shape, the water, around those and then come back later and take the mask off when I was mostly done with the water. Now I'm not adding any reflections to this, I'm just putting the darker color in there. Whoops, and I'm also not being very careful. All right. So all the way around there. Now I'm going to do the same thing over here so that you can see I've started with the same process. I will dry that and then I'm going to add layers to this one so that you can see the difference between the two. So right now it looks pretty dark. However, watercolor dries 20 to 30% lighter than how you put it on. So you're already dealing with a pigment that dries lighter, whereas oil and acrylic dry darker than how you apply them to your canvas or paper. Okay, so coming around again with the water, and I like using the biggest brush I can until it gets to the point where it is just too big and I'm doing little tiny things and I can't use it because it doesn't have a good enough point for me, or it holds too much water and pigment. These brushes are the Silver Black Velvet and I really like them. They are a blend brush and they have partial synthetic fibers and some natural fibers that help them hold more water and paint. So I'm going to go back over here, get a little more of that in the mix just to kind of have it be similar. I'm trying to make these appear the same value at first, just so that you can see that I'm I mean, basically I could have just painted across the whole thing, but it's easier to wet one and then go wet the other rather than have to try to go across both. Okay. Same colors though. Now some of the other colors that you might see in water, they could be anything from gray to blue. You could have green water, you can have browns in water, you could have reflections that are causing really interesting color in the water. So just because normally we think, oh, the water is blue, does not mean that it truly is. The blue that you're seeing is reflecting from the sky, and the depth of the water can also make a difference. So if it's really deep water, it might be darker in color than it is if it is shallow water. And if it's shallow water, you might have things underneath the water that are giving it some color, some rocks or some branches or the color of the soil. Those kinds of things can make a difference to the look of the water as well. All right, let me get this last little bit. And I am working on an Arches cold press watercolor block, and it's just what I had out. And so a block, oops, I am just having an issue with this lower one. A block is paper that is attached on all the sides, and then this one has an opening here. Some blocks actually have openings on two ends. Sometimes these edges that are sealed don't hold as well, so the paper can pull up. But basically the block is made so that they stack the paper together and then seal the edges, and so basically it's stretched. It does have a little bit of some movement to the paper. It's got a little bit of some hills and valleys, but it's not too bad. So I will let this dry, and then when it is completely dry, I will come back and show you how adding layers can add depth to your painting. And we're doing that by painting water. So I'll be back in a few minutes once it's dry. Now that the watercolor, or the color on the water, is dry, I am ready to go on to the next step. So a couple of things before I do the next layer that I wanted to show you have to do with values. So one of the first things is sometimes you can find a value scale online or value chart online, and so this goes from 10% value, so white would be the border color, and then this has got a little bit of value to it, and it goes all the way up to 100% black. And then I punch holes in mine that I print off for my students. And it's very helpful if you're working from a photograph to be able to get an idea if you've got the value pretty close. Now I know that these lily pads just have one layer, so they're not as dark as the actual photo. So I just wanted to show you that. So if I take the value scale, and then you have to squint at it, so you may not be able to see this in the video, but if you squint and look at that section right there, my lily pad is darker than 10%. So then I can kind of slide that over, and I squint again, and it is a little darker than 20%. And I can slide it over, and right about there they start to blend a little bit. It's probably just a touch darker than 30%. And if I go to 40%, well, it might be right about 40% actually, because they start to blur into each other. And then if I show you maybe way up here at 70%, see how much lighter that little opening is than the 70% value. So then I can look at my photograph and do the same thing. So I can check it at 40%, and at 40% the photograph lily pad value is darker. So if I wanted to make it pretty close to the photograph, then I would need to darken the lily pads with another layer of color. And it could be the exact same color, or it could be a little variation in the color. And it's not that you have to do exactly what your photo is showing you, but if you're kind of struggling with trying to figure out why maybe something is not quite working, generally it's the values. Usually if you're somewhat close on the colors, if the values aren't quite separating enough, if you don't have enough lights or enough darks, we tend to paint mid-value, most of us, and it's hard for us to go dark enough or to save enough of the lights. And in this case, I didn't save any of the lights, so you won't see those here. The other thing you can do is, if you don't have a value scale, you can have your source material that you're working from and just take a piece of paper and hole punch 2 holes in it. And then I usually separate them, because sometimes where I'm trying to lay the opening down, I can't quite get them close enough otherwise. So if I look at the water, so here's the water right there. If I look at the water, kind of in a lighter area of the water, and then I look at my water, you can see where those 2 shapes or 2 circles are very different in value. So right here, then you may be able to see, oh yeah, I can see that there's a difference between the lily pads and the gray of the water, but their values are still pretty close. So one last thing, if I take this and I hold it at about 40%, so that's pretty good, where we guessed that that was pretty close in value, and then I go down here and squint, my water is actually just a touch darker than 40%. It's about 50%. So this is just a little bit darker than my lily pads. So I want to push it darker, not only because it helps separate the lily pads, but it helps give it a little more drama. And also, if I were doing this as my image, I would want my water to be darker, because I like that value of the water for this. It helps with the depth of the scene, and it helps make the lily itself stand out to have this area darker and less information in there. So I am going to use that sort of as my source, and then I'm going to go darker in value. Now, one of the things that I tend most of the time to have my board tipped about 2 inches off the table, because that helps move my paint down the painting. It helps keep backgrounds from happening, that kind of thing. But when I am trying to paint something darker, some of the time I will actually lay my paper flat. So I am going to use the same colors I had before, and I'm just going to add another layer. Now, this may not be dark enough once I get it on there. It really can depend on the colors you're using. It can depend on how much water is in your brush or how much water you have in your pigment. So that is another thing to notice. When I'm pulling the paint out, it does move on my palette, but it's not really thin. You can see that I'm pulling out dark color, and that's because my brush is wet, but I do not have a lot of water over here in my well for my pigment. So this is indigo, and I'm going to use the Quinn Burnt Scarlet that's already out, and it's dry on my palette, but I'll just kind of wake it up with the indigo and see if I can get enough to pull up right there. And I don't know that I need to add more, but we'll go with this. That's darkened it a little bit. And then if I end up needing more, I'll probably just use a separate brush to pull out some indigo or some Quinn Burnt Scarlet. So I am not going to work on this one, just this one. And this time I'm not wetting my paper prior to adding the paint. So I'm just doing this on dry paper, and that will also help if you are trying to get a dark value on your paper. Now I can, if I want to give this water a little variation, I can wet my brush while I'm adding the paint on there, and just by dipping in my water, see how all of a sudden that's a lighter passage? So that little bit of water can add interest to your the water you are painting, because if it is just a solid value, sometimes it will look too flat. It will look like a kind of a hole rather than maybe a deep area of the water or a darker color in the water. All right, and now I want to kind of go back right around the lily on this opening here because I want this area to be a little darker. Maybe it's a little more in shadow right here from the overhang of the lily in the water. Just a little variation. And then I will come around over here. So this worked out pretty good, this layer, but I might decide, like I said, once it dries, that I might want to go a little darker. I will have to see. So I'm going to fix right in there with a little bit of the darker value, and then, oh, geez. All right, that's okay, because lily pads often have little indentations and curved edges, so I'm not going to worry about it. Now again, right there, I touched my brush into my cup of water just so I could lighten the value that was on my brush. And it makes it a little more interesting than just the flat black or the flat dark, depending on your colors. Okay, so I have that dark value in, and it needs to dry, and then I'll know if it went dark enough. And it kind of looks like it did right now, but I'll go ahead and dry it, and then I will come back and let you see. That already you can see, I believe, that the lily pads are standing out. They have more separation between the lily pad and the water because of those value changes that happened. That was only 2 layers. Now, you might want to work it up slower, or maybe your colors are different so that you need to adjust and add layers. Sometimes I will do 8 to 10 layers in an area in order to get it the way I want. Now, I could decide at this point that, okay, that's not quite exactly as dark as I wanted it, so maybe I want to add another layer. And up in here, it feels dark enough. It's kind of just down in this section and also where that little bloom there happened. So what I would do is take some clear water at this point, and I'm adding the water because I want to have the edges, when they connect, when I add the new color, not have a hard edge. So I'm giving the pigment that I will be putting on a place to move to and not create that hard edge. So I'll show you in just a second. So hopefully it will make sense. All right, so I have the clear water over, and I am brushing very gently, so I'm not trying to wake up that pigment that is there already. And I'm going to get a little more of my Quinn-Burnt Scarlet out. Now, to make a dark value, sometimes if I'm trying to make black, my actual favorite mix is phthalo blue and permanent alizarin crimson. And the reason I like those two is they're both staining colors, and they have very deep value ranges. They go very dark. For the alizarin crimson is a very kind of cooler, deeper red, and then the phthalo blue. And so that's what I will use if I'm trying to get a black. I don't use 2 blacks, just because I like to have the variety in my blacks when I mix them and be able to push them one way or another. So actually, speaking of variety, right now the color that I put on has more of the Quinn-Burnt Scarlet in it, so it's warmer than this background color, which I'm okay with. I don't mind having that variety, but I will put just a touch of that up in there so that they look like they go together. And then as I come down into here, I'm going to do that same thing again where I have a lighter area, but I'm going to dry the back of my brush, and I'm going to go get a little bit of the indigo on it because I don't want it too warm. And then I need to go get some water. And Just trying to keep those moisture levels that are on my paper the same. All right, so now I've got a cooler area right in here and a warmer black right next to it, which gives it a little more interest in the water. So if someone comes up to your painting, they may not realize that there's that difference, but it is a little more interesting than just maybe a solid black color there. So then that might be where I would leave the water at this point. Now I might go into my lily pads and add some layers to them, and then I might decide, well, okay, my water maybe isn't dark enough yet, so then I have to go back and make some adjustments. So for me, watercolor is about kind of the push and pull. So you change something over here, you may have to adjust something over there in order for it to work. Now this one I could just play with right quick, just to show you another method. And so I'm going to use, I think I'm going to use some greens and blues in the water over that gray, and they will be a little muted then because there is gray in the water already. But I'm going to do this one wet and wet. So this is another method that you can do, and wet and wet basically means I'm placing water on the paper and then I will add my color. Now I should have gotten my color out to start, but since I didn't, I will have to work fast, and I may have to come back and re-wet the upper part of this because there are enough little angles in here that I'm trying to catch with my water, that it takes a few seconds, and this can already be drying up there. So a little more water, and I'm coming around the shapes there. Okay, now I'm going to go get my pigment out. I think I will use ultramarine blue and my sap green, and so this is going to completely change the look of this water. It won't be as muted, it'll be more vibrant, and depending on how I use it, these two colors, it'll look completely different than this one. And you actually do see when I'm at water lily ponds and I have pictures, as you can see over here, these are very dark, and that's because either they've put a dye in the water or maybe the surroundings around the water are causing shadows or things like that to keep the water looking darker. So, all right, so I have sap green out and I have ultramarine blue. And I think I'm going to start with a little bit of the mix together, and my paper is just a touch dry up here. Now I can still leave some of the gray peeking through if I'd like, which I kind of like that look. And right now I'm just playing, and sometimes the best way to learn is just to allow yourself to play and try things. And don't get overly concerned with everything being perfect. We tend to tie ourselves in knots sometimes when we do that. So, all right. Just coming down. So there might be something reflecting in the water that's causing these colors. It could be the lily pads themselves. It could be some trees that are around them. And this is actually starting to dry down here. So I'm going to get my other brush and try to put some water on kind of quickly. So that's the problem with placing the water on the paper before you get your color out, because it can dry so fast that you don't have enough time to work with it. All right, so then I'm going to come down in through here. And I'm actually running out of my ultramarine. That's okay. And then as I come next to this edge, and that gives a little motion in the water as well to have some of that lighter gray peeking through. So now you can see that by adding that next layer, that next value to that area, I have darkened the water. I've made it more interesting than maybe that first flat color. Allow some of that color to peek through. Now I could decide, like I said over here, that once I add another layer to the lily pad, that maybe this isn't dark enough, but this is a step in the process. So two different versions of kind of the same idea, and it can be trying to put the color all in at one time, or maybe having to come back and add layers to it. So when you're trying to create dark water, don't feel like you have to get it in there the first time. It kind of depends on what you're doing, but you can always go back and add to an area and use the clear water to give you a connection. So if you have an area that maybe you want to go darker, you don't want to adjust maybe the top part of something, then placing some water on there and then coming next to it can link them together without having to paint back over some area that you're liking that value for. I hope this was helpful, and I hope you are enjoying experimenting and the process of learning watercolor. And if you have a question or on a tip or trick or technique in watercolor that you would like to see, please comment below and like and subscribe, and that will help me out and get my videos out there for others to learn. So I hope you have a good day, and see you next time. Bye.